Good afternoon, everyone, and also good morning, depends on where you are viewing our program today. We would have a panel discussion today. Uh, as you know, recently there has been a agreement between the 5+ countries and also the Iranian regime on the nuclear issue. After this agreement, many questions has been raised about the impact of this agreement on various areas regarding situation in Iran and in the region as well as the world. Uh, we have a panel discussions with distinguished guests from United States, from UK, and also from Norway. That from UK, Lord Maginnis will join us. Lord Maginnis is a prominent member of House of Lords in Britain. From United States, Professor Raymond Tanter. Professor Raymond Tanter is a renowned a scholar who has been also working in White House National Security Council during the Reagan-Bush administration. And also from Norway, Mr. Lars Rise, former member of parliament in this country, who has followed the developments in Iran for the past 3 decades, would join us. And later, we would have Professor Alejo Vidal Quadras, former president of the European Parliament, and also the president of In Search of Justice, and a non-governmental organization based in Brussels. And we will have 4 subjects that we will discuss today. The subjects that we have, we begin with Lord Maginnis from UK. That Lord Maginnis will please join us. Thank you for joining us today. We would like you to begin with your remarks regarding the situation in Iran.
Well, I think the situation in Iraq is very serious. I think we're under a real delusion if we think that somehow the Iranians have rolled over and surrendered their position to the West. Quite simply, that has not been the case. Of course, they've been under considerable pressure. Their assets have been frozen, and now by giving a promise, not unlike the promises they gave in the past about inspection of nuclear resources and so on, they're going to have access to $150 billion, which you and I know will be spent on arms, on further nuclear development, and will not benefit the people of Iraq in any way. On top of that, we know that a great deal of surreptitious work has gone on, hiding of scientific resources connected with nuclear development. We wouldn't have known about that except that some decent peace-seeking Iranians have been giving us information, and when it's checked out, it's found to be accurate. So we're starting almost with a blank sheet, not knowing where the most advanced research is happening. We're going to hand all the assets that they have back to the Iranian mullahs, and God help us all is all I can say. The influence, the terrorist influence throughout the world that is sponsored by Iran will continue.
Thank you very much, Lord Maginnis. I would like Mr. Lars Rise to address the situation of human rights that is going on in Iran today. What do you think the impact of the nuclear issue and the nuclear agreement would be on that situation?
Thank you, sir. I'm afraid it will not really help anything on human rights now. The image for the Iranian government has increased a lot after this deal, which I think is a shame, and I think it is not going to work. We know that Iran has been desperate to get rid of the sanctions. Why? Because the sanctions were working. They were working more and more, and the regime got more and more desperate to get removed the sanctions. And we know that there has been, the last 2-3 years, there has been a very intensive activity towards the Capitol Hill. NGOs, so-called Iranian NGOs, they have approached the congressmen, the senators, and begged them, please help us to lift the sanctions. And I think when the Iranians came to the negotiation table, they were almost like beggars, please give us a deal here. And I don't think what has been given is in any way sufficient. And therefore, the hope is in Tehran, I guess, to get sanctions lifted as soon as possible without complying. So we will see now how this develops. The most worrying thing is, of course, what was mentioned here about the $100 billion, because now I think there has been celebrations in the Hezbollah headquarters in Beirut, in the Hamas headquarters in Palestine, and other actually terrorist groups who are celebrating because they can now get more funding. Actually, I'm quite sure that this is what may happen. And this will, of course, not help on the human rights situation in Iran. We saw editorials in some of the leading newspapers in Norway that now with the election, I'm speaking about the situation after Rouhani was elected, that now the situation will get better on human rights because he's more soft-spoken and he's more a man of, more committed to human rights and more interested in contact with the West. We have seen more executions now than almost ever before. So it's very worrying what is happening inside Iran. I think the regime, with the increased desperation, they have committed more and more violence towards the population and actually crimes against humanity, the way they are operating. So it doesn't look good. We have, of course, one small hope when we look at the US Congress, but the hope to have 2/3 of the votes is not very big. But I think what happens from now on until the ratification of the deal will be crucial.
Thank you very much. And Sir Raymond Tanter, I would like you to address the issue concerning the Iranian regime's policy in the region and what kind of impact the nuclear agreement would have on that region.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and hello to my colleagues from the UK and from Norway and perhaps from Spain. First of all, what I did was to conduct research on I compared the difference between the official Arab Gulf responses on one hand and the press, the editorials and other op-ed pieces conducted by newspapers in the Sunni Arab Gulf states. And what I found was that the official Arab state leaders were very conciliatory sounding toward the Iranian regime, saying that they hoped that a new era of engagement with Iran would open up, except for the Saudis. The Saudis weren't nearly as forthcoming as some of the others. And in the editorial pages, however, especially now in Saudi Arabia, I found a tremendous criticism of the Iranian regime. On one of the first things they said was that that in the Gulf press was that that President Obama is leaving a legacy of disaster for the region with respect to the nuclear agreement. And how is this a disaster? Well, President Assad, who is supported by some of the money that Lord Maginnis mentioned, has been freed to facilitate, ironically, the work of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. There's something like an entente cordiale that suggests that ISIS won't attack the Assad regime, and the Assad regime won't attack ISIS, but both will attack the Free Syrian Army, the group of moderate Syrians who should have the support of the West. How is this criticism also manifest? Well, as Parliamentarian Lagerstrom from Norway mentioned, the regime in Iran is supporting the Shiites in Hezbollah. Even though Hamas is Sunni, they're supporting Hamas and creating an arc of Shiite terrorism, an arc of trying to control the Sunni Arab states, and that is wreaking havoc. And another thing is that the Sunni Arab press, especially Saudi press, is saying that the Middle East has changed forever. There's a strategic realignment coming up, taking place. And that was right after the nuclear deal was signed. And there are indications that Saudi Arabia and Israel are becoming closer together. When I served at the White House, this was one of the dreams that I and others had, that the Palestinian issue would not interfere. But that was before the Iran deal was signed in mid-July. And thirdly, the Iran deal gives a green light to nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Before Iran was authenticated as a nuclear threshold state, if you will, there was no need on the part of Saudis to try to get the so-called Muslim bomb. The Muslim bomb was a creation of one of the Bhuttos in Pakistan who actually needed the money and therefore said, let's all the Muslim countries get together, which meant mainly Saudi money. And there is supposed to be a Muslim bomb sitting over there in Pakistan ready to be picked up. I suspect at some point Saudi Arabia will ask for that particular bomb. And fourthly, there is the notion that Iran must change its policy. It is up to Iran to change its policy, not for the Sunni Arab states to change theirs. After the negotiations were agreed to in Vienna, as both of my colleagues mentioned, there were shouts of joy in the councils of the Maginnis, the parliament, and of Iran, so-called parliament of Iran. This is not 1905. And all of a sudden, there's a quick move towards victory celebrations throughout the Shiite-dominated world, with the first leading the victory celebration is Bashar al-Assad. Now, fifth, let's consider a path to the future. And there are 3 points to this path for the future, and they focus on American congressional executive politics. First of all, there has to be an examination of existing U.S. sanctions to see which ones sanction entities that are in violation of UN Security Council resolutions and American legislation dealing with non-proliferation. This is a very important point here, because only Congress can remove those non-proliferation those non-proliferation sanctions, except if President Obama goes to the United Nations first he might be able to box Congress in, because if the UN Security Council takes action first, then it would be very difficult for the Congress to overturn that action on political grounds, but also on legal grounds, because if UN Security Council takes action, that becomes legally obligated for the American government to follow. And thirdly, I think there should be a team set up in the Congress to conduct alternative intelligence assessments, utilizing the intelligence from dissident groups, utilizing intelligence from all sources that can be discovered, because there will be Iranian cheating. The regime always cheats, and when it does cheat, there has to be some kind of vetting of the information. And Congress has already set up something called the Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Office, which provide independent budgetary and policy assessments to those provided by the executive branch, the White House. And what I see is that there needs to be what is called a Team B assessment that would be comprised of what I would call the Congressional Intelligence and Policy Analysis Office, that would have the same kind of major impact. And that's what I hope that's what my research indicates the congressional review is pointing to. So I would like to close on this note that I'm looking forward to this discussion very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Tanter. Yes, Lord Maginnis, you want to make a comment?
I do. We've talked about Iran, but remember, we need to look at our own governments, at the knowledge, the apparent lack of knowledge that there is within our Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And it does appear that the American establishment is not much better. For example, an area that we should know very well because of is the area of Iraq, Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty. We've had the problems going on there for ages, not just when Nouri al-Maliki was the leader in Iraq, but it continues under the present leader. And when I ask parliamentary questions of the Foreign Office, I ask, for example, about the number of refugees that we had accepted over all that period that has passed. And I'm told we've accepted 17. Compare that with Albania, which as far back as 213 had seen the need and the justice and the humanity in accepting almost 250 refugees. Now, compare our previous roles in Iraq, how we'd been involved, how we had left a situation where those 3,400 Iranian refugees in Camp Ashraf were being persecuted by Iran through the Nouri al-Maliki regime, how the Quds force had been allowed to operate in Iraq. And yet that's the sort of answer we get, that we've managed to get round to accepting 17. Now you work that out as a percentage, I think you'll find that is 0.5% of those people. That's the amount of practical help that our Foreign Office appears to understand and appreciate. But it gets worse. I then asked, because I couldn't get a straight answer, I asked then about the number of people who had died in Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty. And you won't believe this. They tell me in the Foreign Office that they don't keep, I can quote you the exact words somewhere here, we don't keep statistics on the number of deaths. I mean, one would have thought that everyone knew that 52 of the people in Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty were killed in cold blood. And if they weren't finished with the first shot, they went round afterwards and did a head job on those who had been injured. 52 people died on the 1st of September 1913, and we don't keep figures. And when I asked then about the conditions in that camp, I'm told that the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq judged the conditions to be well in excess of basic human standards. And yet we know in the very week that this agreement was signed that there was the resources going into Camp Liberty were stopped. There was a barrier against getting them in. Can you imagine in the middle of summer, the idea that they stopped allowing I'm trying to find the exact words. I can't see them now. They actually stopped the machines for cooling and dispensing water, and the bits and pieces for repairing machines that had gone into that had been damaged. Now, let me just ask this, and I hope my colleagues will comment on this. If we are participant by neglect or by ignorance in the humanitarian aspects of what's going on in Iraq, how are we going to ever hold foot to the machinations of the mullahs? Compare what has happened over the last 2 or 3 years or thereabouts that we should know about, that we should have hands-on information about. And our Foreign Office tell us they don't know anything about it.
Okay, and Mr. Rise, you may make your remark.
Yes, sir. The intervention now from Lord Maginnis in many ways shows that we are very much in a war of information, and which sources of information can we trust, and which sources do the different foreign ministries and the Foreign Office in London listen to. And I'm afraid, Honourable Maginnis, that the Foreign Office in London, they are listening too much to Iranian sources, produced information which are proven fake, not true. That has been the case actually in several of the court cases in London.
Yes.
That it was proven that the only source they had of information was actually the Iranian regime. That's why actually the government lost all of these court cases. But it's a shame that the Iranian Foreign Office in London, they are actually not open to information independent sources. They are listening to the Iranian regime, to say bluntly. That's my impression of it. I'm very thankful for the suggestions from Professor Tanter, where he's suggested 3 points of action and the importance of having independent sources of intelligence. And we are, of course, very familiar with the opposition movement and their sources of information, which has turned out to be accurate and true. And we never saw unprecise or
I believe we have lost our connection.
A small story here after the which is made now between the Western powers and Iran is the fact that we have all to assume that on top of the documents on the Iranian side of the table was how can we pressure the other side to have one big chapter about the opposition. That should be part of the deal. From what we know now, from what we have seen, there is no such clause in the documents that the West has obliged to, in some way, fight opposition movement, or it's nothing. Of course, be a secret deal that we don't know about. But I think this is actually a positive thing. It's a small victory. So I will actually congratulate the opposition movement that the people around the table here, on, let's say, on our side of the table, have been in a way vaccinated. Actually, small vaccination against the Iranian propaganda on the opposition movement. So this is small positive, but the rest of it is, of course, horrible.
Okay, thank you. And allow me to begin with the questions. We have received a number of questions from various news outlets. As Zaman International Daily from Iraq, asking questions from Professor Tanter, what is your response to the critics who say that the nuclear deal has loopholes that allows the Iranian regime to pursue its nuclear weapons program?
Yes, I've been to Iraq and I've had good conversations with tribal chiefs, and they were very concerned when I was there in 2008 with the fact that the Iranian regime might have a nuclear umbrella under which the popular militias, so-called popular militias, the Shiite who kill Sunnis in Anbar province and other provinces, and would help the division of Iraq into Kurds in the north, the Sunnis in the west, and the Shiites around Baghdad and a bit to the south. So I think that the nuclear deal will help institutionalize the slaughter of Sunnis in the West and give rise to an even greater domination by the Iranian regime of its neighbor to the West, Iraq.
Thank you very much. And the question we have received to Lord Maginnis is from Al Akhbariya television from Saudi Arabia. Why the Iranian regime, through the government of Iraq, is stepping up the siege on Camp Liberty, in your view?
Well, it's very difficult I mean, if it wasn't for reports that are coming through people like Colonel Wesley Martin, who served in Iraq, and who, when he left there, he's an American, when he left there, he continued to take an interest, and he has the ability to report pretty much on a daily basis. He's done a marvelous job, but if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't actually know what is going on. I just want to, I've just located, I talked to you about the UN UNAMI saying that conditions in Liberty were good. But that answer goes on to say, while the government of Iraq maintains records of the management of the camp, we are not aware of a regular consolidated report produced by the government. The UNAMI monitoring reports have a restricted distribution. Why? As our department goes on and says, as we are not the owners of this information, we are unable to meet your request to place the reports in our library. In other words, it's worse than making a bad deal. We're actually covering up the humanitarian aspects of what is happening in Iraq and in Iran. And I mean, when I think of the virtual boys, young men who are strung up on the end of cranes and hanged by the hundred, it's unbelievable that in this day and age we pretend, with all the communications available to us, we pretend that we don't know what's happening. We do know and we're turning a blind eye. And it's as long as people are comfortable at home and they think more of us are being employed and the wealth of the nation is becoming more stabilized, we don't really care about the legacy that we've left throughout the rest of the world. As a loyal UK citizen, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed. And I leave it at that.
Might I suggest that we keep our answers short in order to allow for larger number of online? I know you can't tell a parliamentarian from the UK what to do because you have unlimited time to speak.
Or one who has been a school teacher.
Yes, it's a good suggestion because we have many questions coming up. But the next question, Mrs. Hoda Fatwan from Al Akhbariya Television from Saudi Arabia. The question is to Mr. Lars Rise and Lord Maginnis. What steps has the Iranian opposition taken to alleviate the suffering of the residents of Camp Liberty? And what role should the EU countries, including France, play in this regard? Mr. Rise?
I am happy to have such a question from Saudi Arabia. I think it's a very key question when we get these almost daily reports now on how the Iraqi authorities are blocking the supplies of food and medicine and all kinds of necessary service for the inhabitants. It's moving towards a human catastrophe there. And it's a shame what has been not done by the UNAMI. I think one key issue here is for the authorities in France, United Kingdom, Germany, and other countries is to contact the top leadership of the United Nations and give reports about how UNAMI is actually working and working alongside, it seems like, with the authorities. We know, as Lord Maginnis, that the Iraqi authorities have worked so close with the Iranian authorities over several years now, and that in some way they have managed to get UNAMI on their side, or they are working in the same team. They have many of the meetings in the Iranian embassy in Baghdad, and it's very worrying how they are actually preparing for a human catastrophe. So the leaders of these European countries should immediately contact Ban Ki-moon and ask for a high-level meeting with the leadership to get it.
Yes, Lord Maginnis, you would...
Well, I will add very briefly to that and say that if it wasn't for, you see, I listened to the professor. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Rajavi's group, we would have much, much less factual information. And the one thing about Mrs. Rajavi's group, it's not just propaganda with them. They actually provide chapter and verse. They actually give us proof and show us what is actually happening. And as I say, I'm ashamed that the American and the British government appear to be trying to cloak that information.
Yes, thank you.
I forgot that part of your question, Mr. Reza. What has the opposition movement done? Of course, it's the most effective and influential resistance opposition movement, I think, in the world today. And it's amazing what the opposition movement has done and how you are spreading information. This program is one example of this. So it's something that we need to support and just continue to get out the truth.
Yes. Professor Raymond Tanter, there is a follow-up question also by the same Azaman International Daily, is that what actions and guarantees exist to prevent the Iranian regimes from misusing the nuclear deal to have a free hand in the affairs of the region, and its human rights violations against its opponents?
Well, I recall Winston Churchill's comment that he would not be impartial between, on one hand, the fire brigade sent in to put out a fire, and on the other hand, the arsonist who set the fire. And taking this a step further with respect to Iran, bringing Iran into an inspections regime to ascertain whether or not it is complying with secret sites like Lavazan 3, Fordo, and Natanz, the latter two of which are supposedly not secret anymore, is like asking the arsonist to tell you where the fire is going to be. The arsonist is setting the fire. So Iran should not be a part of this complex, bureaucratically laden inspections regime that will give the Iranian regime 24 days in order to hide material like it did with respect to Lavazan 1 and Lavazan 2. You cannot allow the arsonist to inspect itself. So what I would suggest is that there would be more attention paid to the idea of a behind the scenes Saudi-Israel strategic alignment, because that would then provide the intelligence resources that would help. And I'm not going to comment. I'm a scholar, and I don't like to comment on too much on one particular dissident group. So what I say, dissident group information in general should be factored into the equation in order to publicize, as both of my colleagues have mentioned, what the Iranian regime has been doing. I thank for the question of Mike. I was in Saudi Arabia, and I would like to say at the end of Ramadan, Eid Mubarak.
And also from Asia Daily from Kuwait, the question is to Mr. Rise and Lord Maginnis. Can you please explain how the Iranian regime is behind the current conditions in Camp Liberty? Mr. Lord Maginnis.
Well, that's very easy to explain. It's quite simply because Nouri al-Maliki was merely a tool in the hands of the Iranians, and the Iranians are. I mean, give them credit in terms of being intelligent, of being able to devise a strategy which allows them to continue their persecution of people. The remarks of the regime's supreme leader Ali Khamenei on Saturday past, where he said the regime's anti-Western and anti-American attitude will continue, and Tehran has no interest in dialogue on other issues. In other words, nobody talks to Iran because they won't actually speak about the conditions in Ashraf or now in Camp Liberty. They won't actually, there is no dialogue. But we all know that the Quds force is operational in Iraq, and there it is. Again, all the advantages lie with the Iranians.
And Mr. Rise, would you comment on this question?
Absolutely. Of course, the topic for this conversation is not the war in Iraq, but maybe it has some connection, because the Iran regime tried for generations to have control over Iraq. We know that. And finally, the US and the UK and other nations that committed this warfare in Iraq, they helped the Iranians. To say it in like a tabloid form, the Iranians got help through this war to get a grip on Iraq. And with that one of the attack, there was a meeting between Iranian top diplomats and US officials in Geneva, where they made a deal that Iran will allow US aircraft, the bomber fighters, over Iran, and Iran will not interfere in the war, but in return, this had promised to bombard Camp Ashraf. That was one of the first days of the attack. Camp Ashraf was bombarded, and about 50 people died. There's a special graveyard in Camp Ashraf. And this interest that we saw in Iran was very interested when they saw the plans of attacking Iraq, because they understood, okay, here is our chance to get influence. And of course, the Shiite population who came into leadership here, they were very, very attentive to the Iranian wishes. So we saw the very strong cooperation between Prime Minister Maliki, his staff, and the Iranian regime. So my answer would be that since the Iraqis took over their own government after the interim governments organized from the US side, Iran has had a tremendous influence in Iraq that has not been seen in ages, if ever.
Yes. Thank you very much. And there is also other questions. One from Mr. Musanna Al-Jaderji from Dasman News Agency in Kuwait, asking Professor Tanter and also Mr. Rise, why does the Iranian regime target the Camp Liberty residents even though they are already in a prison-like conditions?
And unarmed.
Professor Tanter?
Yeah, I would like to defer to my colleagues the comments about Camp Liberty, because they've already elaborated on that. And I was in Kuwait, and I would like to give my regards to our colleagues in Kuwait. I'll defer to Lord Maginnis and Parliamentarian Langerson.
Yes, Lord Maginnis.
Well, I was going to give way to Lars there, but the reality is that we've always been involved in Iraq in strange ways. Go back to the Iraq-Iran war. We supported Saddam. We illegally, the United Kingdom illegally supplied arms to Iraq in the war against Iran, and there's one innocent man in jail this last who came back to a man called Asal Nadir, whose company was used unbeknownst to him to smuggle arms to Saddam. He came back to this country to clear his name and to say, look, I had nothing to do with it. Here is all the proof. And what has our justice system and our foreign affairs machinations led to? 37 documents that would have proved his innocence being PII, that's Public Information Immunity certified. In other words, the man was not allowed to now this may be an aside, but it smacks of the immoral, I use that word, immoral aspect of our attitude to what went on and to what has gone on and to what is still happening.
So why do the Iranians want to block Camp Liberty and make life terrible? Actually, the purpose for the Iranian regime is to kill all oppositionals. We can say that clearly because we know that now between 120 and 130,000 members of the opposition movement have been killed. And we have seen this since the US attack. I mentioned the 50 who were killed one of the first days of the war in Iraq. and we have seen 5 attacks on Camp Ashraf and Camp Liberty, where a lot of people, biggest attack 52 in September 9, and the purpose is members of the wrong and kill people that are in the regime. So it's that the Iranian regime is working overtime to try to make life horrible for the rest of liberty, and the whole blockade, logistical blockade, fuel, medicine, food, and also everything which needs, I mean, the fuel is very crucial because it's the temperature is 50 degrees and it's horrible to be inside there with no air condition. And the purpose is killing, but now it's kind of an indirect because it's some limitations to how much they can get done. But we need to shout loud and alarm the whole Western community to put pressure on the United Nations in order to make UNAMI fulfill their obligation in Iraq.
Yes, thank you. And, Mr. Sarmad Abdul Karim, editor-in-chief of Iraqi news agency, would ask that why does Europe insist to such an extent to have relations with the regime in Tehran, even though Europe knows well that the regime will never miss an opportunity to create global instability, including in Europe. Mr. Professor Tanter, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, please. I think that the West is living in a fantasy world. Europe and the United States both think that you can search for and find a moderate in Iran. This search for a moderate is one of the features of Western diplomacy with respect to Iran. Ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there was the idea that there would be a moderate. And I call that the flavor of the year. First, Ayatollah Khomeini had a moderate whom he didn't really like, and that was Ayatollah Montazeri. And Montazeri was supposed to succeed Ayatollah Khomeini, and but that didn't happen because Khomeini just said, there will be no moderates. And that resulted in the killing of 130,000 plus dissidents, oppositionists that my colleagues to which they've already referred. And secondly, then Khatami was going to be a moderate, but he didn't turn out to be much. He didn't turn out to be a moderate at all. And I won't list them all, but every time now Rouhani is supposed to be the latest moderate. And as my colleagues have pointed out, more executions have taken place in Iran under Rouhani. Now, Rouhani's apologists would say, but one of the Larajanis controls the judiciary. But Rouhani is the president, and he hasn't said a word about all of these executions. He could go to the Majlis and say, this is unacceptable. And so there are no moderates. So that's this fantasy world that the West lives in. And I think that they will soon learn when this Iranian deal blows up that Ayatollah Khamenei and his President Rouhani and his foreign minister Zarif are not moderates.
Okay, and Lord Maginnis, would you like to comment on this question?
Well, it's in fact, it's very difficult to add to anything the professor has just said, except can I perhaps at this stage I should say something to you, sir. I hope that a copy of this programme will be sent to every minister in our Department of Foreign Affairs, personally delivered, because I've been waiting for 5 months with 2 other colleagues to be able to speak face to face with the most junior minister in the department. And he hasn't had time to meet me yet. Now, that is the sort of head in the sand politics that we are facing. And if that's the only thing that goes out from your program today, then it's important that the world knows that our leaders are betraying not just us, but they're betraying the most vulnerable people in the world. And that can't be right.
And Mr. Rise, why? What do you think, and why the Europe insists on having relations with this regime?
Well, I can speak for Norway. The history of the Norwegian-Iranian relations are long. I mean, before the time of the Shah, but now with this regime, it's of course the very big findings oil and gas. So the Norwegian state oil company has been engaged, but it was not very successful because of the necessary bribes to make with the son of Rafsanjani, and actually big reactions in Norway because it's illegal with bribes. So, but I think these very big assets of oil and gas is one main reason. It's one of the biggest in the world, actually. So now, if it starts as they hope, they will be one of the main producers in the world. That's one main topic here. When it comes to Professor Tanter, who, by the way, had a very long answer now. He spoke very long, I think. So he forgot himself, okay? We can forgive that. But he had a very interesting analysis. So it was necessary to spend some time on Rouhani and Khatami and so on. They seem to be moderate, but they are not. But actually, they have no power, practically no power. They are like a press spokesperson for the power who sits behind the supreme religious leader, who is actually making the decisions and who has now approved the deal which was made. But he has modified, and so we really. But I think the problem for Rouhani is that they had practically.
And Mrs. Sohal Qaisi from Palestinian website Dunya Al-Watan is asking Lord Maginnis, what are the options for guaranteeing the protection of Camp Liberty residents?
Oh, I think we've got to have access. I mean, as I said in the answer, you know, the UNAMI owns the reports on Camp Liberty. Therefore, my government can't openly discuss them, can't place copies in the library. I've already emphasized that. Well, somebody has got to continue to trump the heels of our members of government to ensure that they do not cover up the shortcomings of UNAMI. UNAMI, the United Nations, belongs to you and me. It is responsible, and in the long run, to individual governments. It is not meant to be a barrier against individual governments meeting their responsibilities. And that's where the pressure has got to as your panel here today will have done. That's where we put the pressure. We need more and more, right, Lars? I see Lars wants to get in there. That's where we've got to put more and more and more pressure.
Yes, Mr. Rise?
I think I said the reason I have this in Camp Liberty today is not because in Iraq. It's because powers who has made a political decision to keep there. Because there has been at least one opening where one country was willing to take all 3,000 of them. But this country was dependent on getting green light from the State Department in the United States. And the State Department said no. They are reflecting the Iran regime. And this is the case for United Kingdom, who accepted 17. They are afraid of provoking Iran. And they have been very afraid of provoking them during these negotiations. So the lack of courage to do what is right is, I think, a main reason why they are being kept there. So it's mainly, the responsibility lies mainly on the Western powers, why they are there.
Yes, thanks. And there is one question also to address to Lord Maginnis and also Mr. Rise. Is the Al-Abadi government better than Maliki government in regards to Camp Liberty residents? Lord Maginnis.
You want me to go first? The answer is that there possibly is a slight improvement, but it's not an improvement in intent. Possibly. It is not manifesting itself in reality.
Mr. Rise?
I agree with this. There is, of course, it is an improvement because it to have responsibility for 4 or 5 military attacks, massacres, which have not been frequent now. So when we saw during the Maliki regime, the squad force and the actually military forces under the command directly under the when it's as it slow down we that there are
Excuse me, Mr. Rise, would you please repeat your last 2 sentences because we had interruption in the voice? We could not.
Yes. Yeah, I'm just saying that it has, of course, been an improvement since we have not. We of course, if there is new plans now coming up very soon to have new military attacks or actual killings of residents there, but we saw more of this during the Maliki regime. So, but what they are doing now is just a more slow, painful death, I think.
Yes, thank you. And Professor Tanter, Mrs. Suad Aziz from the Jordanian daily Mustaqbal Al-Arabi asks, are there any Iraqi player or political parties who oppose or reject that what is happening in Camp Liberty?
I've been to Camp Ashraf, and I have many friends at Camp Liberty because I study at opposition groups, but I think I would rather talk about the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, threat to the Gulf. I'd like to stick with my instructions when I agreed to appear on this program, and that is to stick with the nuclear agreement's effect on the region. So I again defer all questions about Camp Liberty to my colleagues. That was short, eh?
Yes, and Mr. Rise, would you respond to what would be your response to this question?
Yeah, the whole for me.
The question is, are there any Iraqi players or political parties who oppose or reject what is happening in Camp Liberty?
Absolutely, this is promising that Iraq, there are strong voices in Camp they are not in power. One point, in Iraq is signed on a support document for the residents in Camp Ashraf. And we have now quite recently got another document with more than 100 members of parliament from the Iraqi National Assembly in support of the residents in Camp Liberty. So the Iraqi society is quite supportive, but the brutal dictatorship on the top is more attentive to the
Yes, there is also a question that we have received on the Twitter. This is from Professor Tanter. The question is that is there any guarantee that control the Iranian regime doesn't spend that money for terrorist activities in the region? The money that is released from sanctions.
There is no guarantee whatsoever that terrorist activities will decrease as a result of the $150 billion or, $10 billion. So that could fund many terrorist activities. The 9/11 attacks were, I think, costing $350,000 or something like that. And that's not much money. So there's no guarantee whatsoever. But I would like to say something about the fact that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and the Quds Force operatives have been conducting operations in Argentina. They hired some Mexican drug kingpins to come in and to try to assassinate the former ambassador to Saudi Arabia in a restaurant that I frequent, by the way, in Washington. And there are all kinds of activities in 35 countries that the Pastaran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, operates. The Quds Force is a dangerous force operating in the world. So this is a tremendous thing that it's hard to stop. And the final thing is that the IRGC is one of the most influential aspects behind the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader is 76, going on 77 years old, and he's not in good health. There's going to be an election of one of the groups to select a new Supreme Leader, and there are many people in the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, who want to come to some kind of a understanding that the Ayatollahs should not be the only ones to dominate the government. So this is a very momentous time, and I don't believe, by the way, Mr. Langerson, Parliamentary Langerson, that the oil and gas money is a primary motivation, because there's a revolution going on in the economy of oil and gas, not just in the United States with respect to shale, but with respect to finding oil and gas in the North Sea and all kinds of other places. So I don't think it's just oil and gas. I think it's the fantasy, the dream of having Iran as the prize, just as China was opening to China, and that was a key to stabilizing the world. Iran is strategically located, but it's not much of a prize on the economic front as it used to be.
Mr. Rise, Langesund is my city, so I'm Mr. Rise from Langesund.
Yes. Pardon me. I've been to your country, but not to your city, Mr. Rice.
Okay, thank you.
And also, there is a number of questions regarding the situation of Camp Liberty, as addressed to Lord Maginnis and also Mr. Rise. The question is that how difficult is the situation now in Camp Liberty, and which I would read some of these questions that we have received. How dangerous is the living condition there now? and what can be done in order to end the siege that is going on, and what is the conditions of the patients and ill people in the camp, given the current situation there. Also, one question is also about Mr. Faleh Fayyaz, which is the Iraqi National Security advisor, that what can be done to file a case against him, because as you know, he is in giving these orders for repression of the camp residents. What can be done in this regard?
Let me ask a quick question. When does the program end? Because I have another press obligation. When does this program end?
We will end at about 20 minutes from now.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think in deference to Professor Tanter, I think that he, having more, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a simple old village schoolmaster and soldier, but having said that, and I'm older than, I'll tell Professor Tanter now that I'm older than the guy he's just written off at being 77. So be careful. The reality is that it is a legal question. It is a diplomatic and legal question. It's more in Professor Tanter's field to answer that than in mine.
Okay, and Mr. Rise?
Well, the question was a problem, and that is the all the different efforts to stop the supplies and make life horrible inside the camp, and actually that it's false reporting from UNAMI, which is really the most disturbing, that UNAMI is not they for when from delivering the necessary supplies, but they don't even report it in a truthful way. That is maybe the most disturbing thing. And of course, the risk that several of the residents may die soon because of lack of medication and even cooling and water and food is high, especially because it's 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius inside the camp yesterday, as it was measured. And the 4 last days, they have not allowed the vehicles with food, medicine, and fuel. And this makes it very critical. And it's very hard here up in Norway, and it thinks somebody is listening to this can actually do and will be to the nations. I think you are to help and protect and in a way.
Yes, thank you. And then, Mr. Tanter, we have received a question regarding there is some talks that now that the nuclear agreement has been reached with the Iranian regime, is it possible that to get Iranian regime involved in solving the problem that exists in Syria now?
Well, look, the Iranian regime is the key to resolving the problem in Syria because the regime is the problem in Syria. But there's no way that Khamenei and Rouhani and his followers are going to change policies. They look, the Iranian Revolution is committed to exporting itself abroad in order to control the people at home. This is one reason why the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was set up, to protect the revolution. And the Quds Force, the special force thugs, I would call them, are the ones who are operating outside into the region. So there's, as long as the leaders of Iran consider the religion the state and the state the religion, it's going to expand. Okay. The second is that from a strategic point of view, it makes sense for Hezbollah in Lebanon to get 15,000 or so rockets poised to attack Israel, for Hamas to get 10,000 short-range rockets poised to attack from the south, and then have Syrian forces operating along the Golan Heights, providing Hezbollah a base to attack Israel. So Israel would be surrounded by rockets from the east, the north, the south, and the lifting the conventional arms um, as part of the negotiations with Iran is a huge mistake, because that allows for ballistic missiles, which have no purpose other than nuclear purposes, to be used in against the European countries, against the United States. So there's this nexus of conventional and nuclear arms that's all sort of hidden in the nuclear agreement.
Yes, thank you. And we have received also questions from Mr. Fatah Al-Janabi from Iraqi website Hawar Mutamaddin. The question is, what are the ways available to assist the residents of Camp Liberty? Lord Magnus, would you like to respond to that?
I will. First of all, I think that anyone who is interested in the future of those people in Camp Liberty ought to make themselves familiar with the 10-point document that Mrs. Rajavi's NCRI has published. It sets a standard for behavior and political ambition. But more than that, when do we ever see a headline in our local press that is equivalent to the sort of headline we got when 38 people sadly were murdered in Tunisia? We quite simply don't. One of the things we need to do is to get our press to play its responsibility. Now, more than ever in our country, we have a government that seems to react today on what the press said yesterday afternoon. So maybe a slight exaggeration, but only slightly. The reality is that we have not got the leading papers in the West to properly headline the tragedy of the Middle East. Not particularly Camp Liberty, but certainly Camp Liberty would rank very highly in morally. It should rank very highly in how Western press discuss it.
And thank you. And Mr. Risa, in this question is addressed to you. Excuse me. Why the Iraqi government is refusing to recognize Camp Liberty as a refugee camp?
Well, it's in a wrong way in the Tehran. That is and that question. There has been developed very strong ties between Tehran and Baghdad through the last years, and I don't think they have weakened a lot. There are some limitations now, but they are obliged to do whatever they can to please Iran. That with to document it.
And thank you very much. And Mr. Professor Tanter, the question is to you: how do you see? Would you see that Iran nuclear agreement would be approved by the Congress? And if not, what happens?
Uh, Congress can approve or disapprove. If Congress approves, then it gives quite a boost to President Obama, and it puts the onus on him, however. So if the approval takes place, President Obama is going to be responsible for what happens when the Iranian regime starts to cheat, and it will cheat. If there's a disapproval, I believe that it will be very difficult for the Republican-controlled Senate to gain enough Democrats to override a veto that President Obama has. So I think that the unsigned accord will have the momentum of a UN Security Council resolution, will have the momentum of the president holding a few Democrats on board, and that deal is a done deal as far as I'm concerned. At issue is how can the general public who does not support the deal try to change the atmosphere, and I think programs like this are helpful. I'm going to have to bow out now, and I want to thank you for inviting me here, and I'll send my regards to my colleagues, and I know the difference now between a city and the last name of one of my colleagues from Norway. So I have to sign off.
Thank you very much, Professor Tanter, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Hoda Hafiz.
Lord Maginnis, this question has been directed to you. That what kind of international activities or campaigns can be done in order to have this issue of Camp Liberty highlighted and attract attention?
A great deal has been done, and a great number of people do know the reality of Camp Liberty. The problem is that as long as we have UNAMI and the American administration and the British administration cuddling up to Abadi and now to the Iranian regime, very little is going to be done unless we can somehow persuade a press system throughout the Western world to step up. Look, I have offered, my friend Colonel Wesley Martin has offered, others of us have offered to go to Camp Liberty, and our governments won't support the idea of us going there. Now, if we cannot get people, I have no axe to grind at 78 years of age, other than to see people who are under pressure having at least some signs of decency and freedom in their lives. That's why I'm on this bandwagon, I might call it that. But it is important, and until there is a demand out there for people like Lars and myself and Raymond and others to be able to go and visit Camp Liberty, then the truth will be hidden.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Rise, the question is to you that there has been recently, after the nuclear agreement reached, there has been raid on prisons in Iran, and also we have seen some political prisoners in Iran put under pressure by the Iranian regime. do you think this is related to the nuclear deal? How do you view that? And if there is, what can be done after this deal has been done with the Iranian regime?
Deal has led to a bigger self-image in Iran now, which has allowed this. I'm afraid that the reason may be very simple, that before they had a deal, they were to do provocative things like this. But now, after they have the deal and they feel very sure that this will pass the US Congress, then I think they feel free now to do things like this, which they don't need to sit and calculate, do we lose something or do we gain something? Or, I mean, the gain is how they see it, and that's why they do it.
Yes, thank you very much. And Lord Maginnis and also Mr. Rise, we have few moments that if you would like to make some concluding remarks on the situation on Camp Liberty or issues regarding the human rights situation in Iran. Lord Maginnis?
Thank you. First of all, I would thank you for inviting me onto the panel this afternoon. It has been helpful for me just to get some of those simple humanitarian ideas across to the public who may be watching. I now hope that our own press, our own government, I haven't been easy on our press or on our government, but I'm a loyal UK citizen. I'm loyal to the United Kingdom to the last minute, and I don't want to see us in shortfall when it comes to meeting our international responsibilities. I don't want to see ministers in my government hiding from me when in fact there is the possibility, there is the opportunity, there is the duty to do something. That's it. I'm grateful to you, sir, for your courtesy this evening, and to my colleagues. Thank you.
And Mr. Rise, would you like to make the last comments?
I want to thank for this opportunity to be present here and to be part of this very fruitful discussion. And of course, we don't know how many are watching this and how many have been listening today. But I would like to say, especially to the United States representing this, that there is a special responsibility because of the documents of guarantee have been issued to each of the
Excuse me, we lost your voice. Would you repeat the last sentence, please?
Yes, it has. We know that it has been issued letters, documents of guarantee from the U.S. government to each citizen, to each resident of Camp Ashraf and now Camp Liberty, which gives a special responsibility to the U.S. government to follow up this. How can we trust such a letter of guarantee after this if it's not being followed up? And I'm sorry that it's been very heavy politics. Do I lose if I do that? In the right, so it is a burden now, but I think that there's now in the US who will voice this view and who will stress the importance of following up a commitment that has been made. And that is my hope today, that the US will comply with this.
Yes, I would like to thank you for joining us today and for this discussion. And we would have this video on the YouTube, so people can also view later, the ones that they could not join us live in this event. And I once again thank you for your participation, and have a good day.
Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.